If you enjoy losing yourself in tales of misfortune, absurdity, and the occasional vampire, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more stories that straddle the line between soothing and strange. Tonight's offering is the first chapter of How to Survive a Vampire Plague with Just Garlic and Bad Luck Wake, titled The Garlic Merchants, Unfortunate Windfall. Chapter 1. The Garlic Merchant's Unfortunate Windfall. The town of Bracken Hollow had never been particularly kind to Hubert Pembleton. For years he had peddled his wares, garlic mostly, with the occasional foray into onions when times were truly desperate, from a rickety cart that groaned under the weight of his own mediocrity. The townsfolk barely tolerated him, wrinkling their noses at the pungent aroma that clung to his clothes like a second skin. Hubert was used to the sidelong glances, the muttered remarks about his reek, the way children would scatter when he trundled down the street. Garlic was not glamorous, but it was honest work, and Hubert had resigned himself to a life of quiet, aromatic obscurity. That is, until the rumors began. At first, it was just whispers. Strange disappearances in the night, livestock drained of blood, a traveling merchant found pale and stiff in his bed with 2 neat punctures on his neck. The town's elders dismissed it as superstition, the work of wolves or bandits with a flair for the dramatic. But then the baker's wife swore she saw something flit past her window, something too fast to be human, and the blacksmith's youngest son claimed a pale-faced man had grinned at him from the shadows, teeth too sharp, eyes too bright. By the time the mayor's own cat turned up lifeless and bloodless on his doorstep, Bracken Hollow was in a proper panic. And panic, as it turned out, was excellent for Hubert's business. One morning he arrived at the market square to find a crowd already gathered around his cart. Their eyes were wide, their hands clutching coins, their voices overlapping in a desperate chorus. "Garlic, we need garlic. They say it keeps them away." "I'll take 10 bulbs. No, 20. Hubert, ever the pragmatist, did what any sensible merchant would do. He tripled his prices. And still, they came. Housewives shoved each other aside for a single clove. The butcher, a man who had once sneered at Hubert's peasant stink, now begged for a wholesale purchase. Even the mayor, sweating in his fine coat, pressed a heavy purse into Hubert's hands and muttered something about civic duty. By sundown, Hubert's cart was empty, his pockets were full, and his feet ached from standing. He should have been elated. Instead, as he counted his coins in the dim light of his tiny attic room, a slow, creeping dread settled over him. Because garlic was not just a ward against vampires. It was a beacon. The creatures of the night, if they were real, would not be pleased to find their prey armed with such an effective deterrent. And who, precisely, had supplied the entire town with its newfound defense? Hubert Pembleton, the garlic merchant. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow streets, and somewhere in the distance, a dog let out a sharp, sudden yelp. Then, silence. Hubert swallowed hard, clutching a string of garlic bulbs like a lifeline. He had gone from the town's least respected peddler to its most essential merchant in a single day. And now, as the shadows stretched long and the night grew deeper, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer just a salesman. He was bait. Chapter 2. The town crier who cried vampire. Barnaby Sneed had never been a man of restraint. As Bracken Hollow's self-appointed town crier, his job, if one could call it that, was to relay news, announcements, and the occasional royal decree, assuming he remembered the wording correctly. But Barnaby had always believed that facts were merely the scaffolding upon which a truly captivating story should be built. A missing chicken became a poultry massacre. A spat between neighbors transformed into a blood feud. And now, with whispers of something unnatural lurking in the night, Barnaby saw his chance to elevate his craft from mere gossip to something bordering on legend. It began, as most disasters do, with a kernel of truth. Old Widow Hargrove's milk had gone sour overnight, and she swore she heard scratching at her shutters. Barnaby, nursing a tankard of ale at the Drunken Hound, seized the opportunity. "Vampires," he bellowed, slamming his mug onto the table hard enough to startle a sleeping dog. "Saw it with my own eyes. Pale as death, slinking through the shadows, eyes like burning coals." The tavern fell silent. Then, predictably, erupted into chaos. By the next morning, Barnaby's account had mutated into something far grander. The vampire, now plural, had apparently drained Widow Hargrove's cow dry. The cow, in reality, was perfectly fine, if mildly annoyed by the commotion. They had been seen floating above the churchyard, a trick of the fog, most likely. They had even, according to one particularly imaginative stable boy, turned into a swarm of bats and flown straight through the blacksmith's chimney. The blacksmith, upon hearing this, threatened to weld the boy's mouth shut. Barnaby, delighted by the hysteria he had inspired, doubled down. He took to the streets at dusk, ringing his bell with the fervor of a man who had discovered his life's purpose. "Beware the night," he warbled. "Lock your doors, hang your garlic. The blood drinkers walk among us." The problem, of course, was that this time he wasn't entirely wrong. The first real attack came on a moonless night. Jonas the Cooper, a man not prone to flights of fancy, was found in his workshop, pale and gasping, 2 puncture wounds on his neck. He survived, barely, but his account sent Bracken Hollow into a frenzy. Barnaby, for once, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having told the truth, albeit accidentally, and with excessive embellishment. Now, instead of laughing off his tales, the townspeople glared at him with a mixture of accusation and terror. Every new disappearance, every strange noise in the dark was laid at his feet as if he had personally invited the creatures in. The mayor, sweating through his collar, demanded Barnaby to do something useful for once in his life. So Barnaby, ever the opportunist, pivoted. If the town wanted a villain, or a savior, he would give them one. He began holding nightly vigils in the square, armed with a lantern, a wooden stake whittled hastily from a chair leg, and a dramatic flair that bordered on theatrical. He spun tales of his own near misses with the undead, of narrow escapes and daring confrontations. He even claimed to have struck one of the fiends with his stake, though the only evidence was a suspiciously wine-like stain on his shirt. The townspeople, desperate for reassurance, ate it up. Parents thrust their children forward to hear his warnings. Lovers clung to each other, wide-eyed, as he described the vampire's hypnotic gaze. The local priest, who had initially scoffed at Barnaby's antics, now stood beside him, sprinkling holy water with the solemnity of a man who had decided it was better to be safe than sorry. But as the nights grew longer, and the attacks more frequent, even Barnaby's bravado began to falter. Because while he had been lying for years, the vampires, it seemed, had not. And one unsettling truth became impossible to ignore. They were watching him. Not with the mindless hunger of beasts, but with something far worse, amusement. He'd catch a glimpse of a pale face in the crowd, gone before he could point. He'd hear laughter echoing down alleyways, too sharp, too cold to be human. Once he swore he saw a figure perched on the church roof, grinning down at him with far too many teeth. Barnaby had spent his entire life spinning stories. Now, he couldn't shake the horrifying suspicion that the vampires were playing along. That they, too, understood the power of a good performance. And worst of all, they seemed to be enjoying it. Chapter 3. The Curious Case of the Missing Shadows. The realization came slowly, as most unsettling revelations do. It began with Widow Hargrove squinting at the baker during Sunday service, nudging her neighbor and whispering, "Doesn't Bertram look different today?" The neighbor, an elderly man with failing eyesight, merely shrugged. But when the congregation filed out into the noonday sun and Bertram stepped off the church stairs without any dark shape stretching before him, the whisper became a gasp. By dusk, half the town had developed a nervous habit of checking their own shadows every few minutes, like anxious mothers patting their pockets for keys. The other half pretended not to care while surreptitiously angling themselves toward every available light source. Young Tomlin the carpenter proved particularly unfortunate when his shadow failed to appear during a crucial business negotiation. His customer, a superstitious farmer from the next valley, took one look at the blank wall behind him, screamed something about devil's bargains, and fled without signing the contract. Tomlin spent the rest of the afternoon standing in various patches of sunlight, growing increasingly frantic as his shadow remained stubbornly absent. The town council convened an emergency meeting in the drafty old guild hall, where Mayor Thistlewick's shadow stretched impressively across the warped floorboards, a fact he pointed out no less than 7 times during proceedings. "We have protocols for wolf attacks," announced Councillor Pettigrew, whose own shadow flickered weakly in the candlelight. "We have procedures for crop blight, but nowhere in Bracken Hollow's charter does it specify what to do when one's neighbors start losing their silhouettes like mislaid gloves." A tense silence followed. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. Then Barnaby Sneed, who had invited himself to the meeting, slammed both palms on the table. "It's the vampires stealing them," he declared, eyes alight with the particular glee of someone who enjoys being right about terrible things. "Everyone knows the undead cast no shadows. They're collecting ours like trophies." This sparked immediate debate. "If they're stealing shadows," argued Mistress Darroway the seamstress, "then shouldn't we be finding piles of spare shadows lying about? I've not seen a single stray shadow anywhere." "Maybe they eat them," suggested the blacksmith's apprentice, then immediately regretted speaking when the entire room turned to stare at him. The meeting dissolved into chaos shortly thereafter when Councillor Pettigrew noticed his shadow had disappeared during the discussion. His subsequent screaming fit did little to inspire confidence in the town leadership. That night saw the first organized, if one could call it that, shadow patrols. Groups of villagers armed with lanterns and questionable courage roamed the streets, alternately checking their own shadows and peering into windows to spy on their neighbors. The butcher caught the cobbler's wife examining her husband's shadow with suspicious intensity. The schoolteacher nearly got conked on the head with a rolling pin when she startled the baker by pressing her face against his bakery window at midnight. Young Jimmy Tallow, the lamplighter's boy, made the mistake of joking that his shadow had run off to join the circus. His mother made him sleep with garlic stuffed in his socks for a week. Meanwhile, those unfortunate enough to have lost their shadows found themselves social pariahs. The tavern refused to serve shadowless patrons, citing an obscure law about whole persons being required for alcohol sales. Children played a new cruel game called Shadow or Shade, where they'd poke suspicious-looking patches of darkness with sticks. Marital spats took on disturbing new dimensions as husbands and wives accused each other of not being all there anymore. The whole affair reached its absurd climax when a delegation of shadowless citizens marched on the mayor's residence demanding equal rights. Their protest lost some momentum when someone pointed out that none of them had brought signs, it being difficult to hold up a placard when you couldn't cast a shadow to prove you were really there. As the days passed, the townspeople developed an intricate etiquette around the shadow situation. It became impolite to mention someone's missing shadow directly, leading to increasingly awkward circumlocutions. "My, doesn't the light pass through you beautifully today?" became a common backhanded compliment. Shopkeepers developed elaborate systems of shadow-based credit, refusing to extend loans to anyone whose financial solidity couldn't be literally projected onto a wall. Through it all, the garlic merchant Hubert watched from his now fortified stall, selling cloves at exorbitant prices to desperate customers. He'd taken to wearing a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in perpetual shadow. Whether to hide his own possible shadowlessness or simply to appear mysterious, no one could say. Barnaby, for his part, had begun claiming his shadow was partially resistant to vampire theft, pointing to its faint outline as proof of his special status. This explanation satisfied no one, least of all his shadow, which seemed to grow fainter with each passing day, as if growing weary of its owner's nonsense. And in the darkest corners of Bracken Hollow, where the lamplight never quite reached, something watched and waited. Something that found the whole shadow business terribly amusing. Something that, if one looked very closely, didn't seem to cast a reflection in windows either. Chapter 4. A Primer on Vampire Etiquette, or lack thereof. The vampires of Bracken Hollow had never been particularly concerned with manners. This became increasingly apparent as their presence in town shifted from whispered rumor to unavoidable nuisance. The problem wasn't so much the blood drinking. The townsfolk could have forgiven that, given time and perhaps some warning, but rather the complete disregard for basic social niceties that made coexistence so difficult. Take Count Vladimir Forfolomef, for instance. The self-proclaimed Lord of Midnight had taken up residence in the abandoned windmill on Gallows Hill and promptly developed habits that would make even the most tolerant host cringe. His habit of appearing uninvited in people's bedchambers at night was bad enough, but his complete unwillingness to wipe his feet before tracking grave dirt across clean linens showed a staggering lack of consideration. Then there was Lady Carmilla Duzangre, who insisted on dramatically materializing out of mist during important town meetings, only to complain about the seating arrangements. "A throne," she would hiss, her pale fingers clutching at the back of the mayor's chair, "requires at least 6 skulls for proper elevation." When told that Bracken Hollow civic decorum didn't include cranial furnishings, she took to dramatically dissolving into bats whenever bored, which was often. The younger vampires proved even worse. A particularly insufferable fledgling named Alistair had developed the habit of turning into smoke and seeping through keyholes just to rearrange people's furniture while they slept. Whacking to find one's dresser moved 3 inches to the left might not sound terrifying, but after the 7th occurrence, the blacksmith had taken to sleeping, with a garlic-stuffed pillow and a mallet under his pillow. It was around this time that someone, probably Hubert the garlic merchant, though he denied it, had the bright idea of creating a pamphlet titled A Civilized Guide to Vampiric Conduct. Printed in shaky block letters on suspiciously rust-colored paper, it appeared nailed to doors throughout town one foggy morning. The contents revealed much about both the vampires' habits and the townspeople's growing desperation. To our distinguished nocturnal neighbors it began, "While we welcome your presence in our humble town, and by welcome we mean tolerate through gritted teeth, we humbly suggest the following guidelines for more harmonious cohabitation." The list that followed included such gems as, on 1, please refrain from hypnotizing livestock for amusement. The cows have stopped giving milk and the chickens now cluck in disturbingly poetic couplets. 2, floating outside second-story windows to watch people undress is considered rude unless expressly invited, and no, saying, "Come in when you're already inside" doesn't count. 3, while we appreciate the dramatic flair, could the midnight howling be kept below a dull roar? The baker's newborn hasn't slept in a week. 4, if you must drain someone nearly to death, have the courtesy to at least wipe their neck afterward. The bloodstains are ruining everyone's best colors. 5, garlic may be offensive to your refined sensibilities, but so is your habit of leaving coffins in people's root cellars without asking. The vampire's reactions ranged from amused to indignant. Count Vladimir allegedly laughed so hard he accidentally turned into a wolf mid-chuckle and got stuck that way for 3 days. Lady Camilla wrote a scathing reply in what appeared to be blood. Pig's blood, she insisted, on the side of the butcher's shop, though most of it was illegible due to her overly elaborate cursive. Alistair took to leaving tiny bite marks on every copy he found, like some sort of petulant literary critic. Meanwhile, actual vampire etiquette, the kind not written by terrified villagers, began emerging through observation. The creatures did have their own strange codes of conduct, albeit ones that made little sense to the living. For instance, it was considered terribly gauche to feed from the same person twice in a week, unless you'd left them a thank-you note. Usually just their own blood used to write thanks on their mirror. Entering another vampire's territory required bringing a gift, typically something macabre like a preserved raven or a vial of someone else's tears. And there was apparently an entire complex hierarchy about who got to brood on which rooftop at sunset, leading to several hissed arguments that kept the whole town awake. The townspeople adapted in their own ways. Dinner parties now included vampire plates, small offerings of rare steak set away from the main table, like one might leave milk out for a cat. People developed the habit of loudly announcing their bedtime routines. Well, off to sleep now, alone, definitely alone in this room, in hopes of discouraging nocturnal visitors. The tavern started serving a drink called the Daywalker's Delight, which was just regular ale with a clove of garlic floating in it, marketed to both vampires wanting to appear sociable and villagers wanting to appear daring. Hubert, ever the opportunist, began offering etiquette bundles, baskets containing garlic, wooden stakes sold as conversation starters, and copies of the conduct guide. They sold surprisingly well, though several were returned with teeth marks in them. Barnaby Sneed, never one to miss a trend, started offering nightly tours of vampire hotspots, leading gawkers to places where particularly dramatic feedings had occurred. His running commentary blended half-truths with outright fabrications, and he'd taken to wearing a black cape that made him look less like a vampire expert and more like a child playing dress-up. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, an uneasy equilibrium settled over Bracken Hollow. The vampires continued to be terrible houseguests, the villagers continued to complain, and Hubert continued to profit from everyone's misery. The shadows remained missing, the garlic remained pungent, and the mayor remained in denial about the whole situation. And in the darkest corners of the town, where even the lamplighters dared not go, something watched this bizarre dance of manners and mayhem with quiet amusement. Because while the living were busy writing rules for the undead were busy making plans of their own. Chapter 5. The Barber-Surgeon's Dubious Cure-All. Dr. Thaddeus P. Bainsworth, Bracken Hollow's sole medical practitioner, had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by either bleeding a patient or shouting Latin at them. When news of the vampire plague first reached his cluttered practice above the tannery, he reacted with the same enthusiasm most men reserve for discovering an extra sausage on their plate. Here, at last, was an opportunity to test some of his more experimental theories. His first attempt at a cure involved leeches. This surprised no one, as Bainsworth believed leeches were the solution to everything from gout to marital discord. His logic was impeccable. If vampires consumed blood, surely removing blood would make one less appealing. The fact that his patients emerged from these treatments pale, weak, and decidedly more vampire-like in appearance didn't deter him in the slightest. "See?" he proclaimed to a gathering at the tavern after his third such treatment, gesturing to the wan-looking miller's son. "No vampire would bother with this one now. He's practically one of them already." This observation did little to comfort the boy's parents, who promptly dragged their son away to Hubert's garlic stall. Unter Terret, Bainsworth moved on to his next remedy: therapeutic shouting. The theory, as he explained to anyone who couldn't escape quickly enough, was that loud noises at specific frequencies could disrupt a vampire's unnatural equilibrium. He began holding nightly tonic bellowing sessions in the town square, where he would lead increasingly hoarse villagers in shouting progressively more elaborate Latin phrases at the moon. "Loquax noctis," he would roar, face reddening impressively. "Loquax noctis," the crowd would dutifully respond, though most mangled the pronunciation badly enough that they were likely just insulting their own mothers in dead languages. The only measurable effect of these sessions was that the vampires started appearing just to watch, perched on rooftops like amused spectators at a particularly bad theatrical performance. Count Vladimir once brought popcorn, or at least what looked like popcorn but might have been dried mouse bones. When shouting failed, Bainsworth turned to more physical interventions. His anti-vampiric postural alignment involved hanging patients upside down from the maypole while reciting scripture. His humoral rebalancing tonic, a foul-smelling concoction of garlic mercury and what he claimed was essence of sunlight, left more patients vomiting than vampirism free. The breaking point came when he introduced his rigorous daylight simulation, which involved strapping patients to a chair and shining increasingly bright lanterns in their eyes while ringing bells. After 3 farmers went temporarily blind, and the tavern keeper's wife developed a nervous tic every time she heard a chime, the mayor finally intervened. "Bainsworth," the mayor sighed, rubbing his temples, "your cures are killing more people than the vampires." "Nonsense," Bainsworth protested. "My methods are perfectly sound. The human body is simply too weak to appreciate them." It was around this time that the Barber-Surgeon made his most controversial discovery. While attempting to extract vampiric humors from the butcher's wife, who had come in complaining of headaches and left complaining of stab wounds, he noticed something peculiar. The blood he'd collected in his leech jar seemed to be moving on its own. Eureka moments being what they are, Bainsworth immediately concluded he'd discovered the secret to vampirism: tiny creatures in the blood. His solution was both predictable and horrifying. "Boiling," he announced to the crowded tavern that evening, "is the answer. We must took the corruption out of our very veins." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of several villagers quietly edging toward the exits. To Bainsworth's dismay, no one volunteered for his revolutionary hot blood cleanse. Under Terret, he decided to test the theory on himself. The resulting spectacle, which involved a modified still, several yards of copper tubing, and a terrified apprentice, left the good doctor bedridden for a week with what he insisted was merely a thorough purification, but looked to everyone else like severe heatstroke. While Bainsworth recuperated, and his apprentice reconsidered life choices, the vampires of Bracken Hollow found themselves in the unusual position of being the more responsible medical practitioner. Lady Camilla took to leaving unsigned notes at the scenes of her feedings with actual medical advice, like perhaps try resting and drink more water. Alistair developed the habit of materializing in Bainsworth's practice to rearrange his surgical tools into rude shapes when no one was looking. The final blow to Bainsworth's credibility came when a traveling physician, an actual trained one, passed through town. After observing one of the Barber-Surgeon's treatments, which that day involved attaching live eels to a patient's ears while chanting, the newcomer quietly suggested Bainsworth might want to consider specializing in something less likely to get people killed. Haircuts, perhaps, the physician offered helpfully. Bainsworth, of course, took this as a challenge. His next and final anti-vampire treatment combined all his previous methods into one glorious, disastrous procedure involving leeches, shouting, boiling vinegar, and a complicated system of pulleys. The demonstration, performed on a particularly unlucky pumpkin, as no human volunteers remained, resulted in what was later described as the closest thing to alchemy we've ever seen, and probably several fire code violations. That night, as Bainsworth nursed his singed eyebrows and contemplated where it had all gone wrong, an envelope slid under his door. Inside, written in elegant crimson script, was a single line: "Perhaps you should try biting people. It's remarkably effective. A professional." The next morning, the townspeople noticed 2 curious developments. First, Dr. Bainsworth had disappeared, leaving behind only a note about pursuing alternative medical training. Second, there was now a new vampire in Bracken Hollow, one with a particular fondness for leeches and an annoying habit of diagnosing everyone's ailments unasked. Hubert, ever the entrepreneur, immediately saw the business opportunity. His new leech and garlic combo packs flew off the shelves. Barnaby Sneed began offering vampire doctor tours, though he had to stop when the undead physician started correcting his facts mid-tour. And the mayor added a new line to the town budget: garlic supplies non-negotiable. As for Bainsworth, he could often be seen haunting the edges of the nighttime markets, offering unsolicited medical advice and complaining that no one appreciated his genius. The leeches, at least, seemed happy with the arrangement. Chapter 6. The Midnight Market of Questionable Goods. The first stall appeared at the crossroads near Gallows Hill under a moonless sky, its proprietor shrouded in a cloak that might have been black or simply very dirty. By week's end, what began as a single rickety table had metastased into a full-fledged nocturnal bazaar that would make any respectable merchant blush. The Midnight Market, as it came to be known, operated on one simple principle. If you were desperate enough to shop after dark, you weren't in a position to ask questions about provenance. Hubert Pembleton, whose garlic monopoly had been threatened by these upstarts, took to skulking about the market in disguise, an effort undermined by his distinctive garlicky aura. He watched in horror as hucksters peddled church-blessed garlic at half his prices, despite the cloves being suspiciously smooth and odorless. "They're pre-peeled for your convenience," claimed one particularly brazen vendor who Hubert strongly suspected was just selling white-painted pebbles. The market's star attraction was its staggering array of anti-vampire weaponry. Stakes of dubious wood quality, guaranteed ash, read the labels on what was clearly pine, sold alongside vials of holy water that smelled distinctly like well brine. One entrepreneurial soul offered sunlight grenades, glass orbs filled with yellow liquid that, when shattered, produced a dim glow and a faint lemon scent. They sold out immediately. The most popular stall belonged to Madame Zorina, a fortune-teller who had pivoted to vampire protection with startling success. Her guaranteed vampire-proof amulets, made from recycled chicken bones and questionable grammar, flew off the shelves despite, or perhaps because of, their tendency to glow faintly green in the dark. When pressed on what exactly they guarded against, she would tap her nose and say, "The things you don't see coming," which struck customers as profoundly wise until they realized it meant absolutely nothing. Barnaby Sneed, never one to miss an opportunity, set up a stall selling authentic vampire hunting tips, scrawled on irregular scraps of parchment. His best-selling item was a map of confirmed vampire haunts that suspiciously resembled the locations of all the town's abandoned buildings and several currently occupied ones. When the cobbler found his workshop marked as a bloodsucker nest, Barnaby claimed it was a misprint and offered him a discount on a warding charm that looked suspiciously like a bent nail wrapped in string. The market's nocturnal nature attracted an eclectic clientele. Respectable housewives rubbed shoulders with grave diggers, both groups clutching their purchases tightly and avoiding eye contact. The town guard patrolled occasionally, though their inspections grew noticeably less thorough after certain stalls began offering night-shift revitalization tonics that smelled strongly of brandy. Even the vampires themselves were rumored to visit in disguise, though what exactly undead creatures might need from a black market remained a topic of hushed speculation. Young Jimmy Tallow, the lamplighter's boy, claimed he saw Count Vladimir haggling over a box of sunlight-proof candles. The candles, when lit, produced smoke that smelled suspiciously of burnt hair and cast shadows that moved independently of their flames. They became immensely popular despite, or perhaps because of this unsettling quality. The market's most controversial section was the prevention aisle, where desperate souls could purchase early warning systems of varying credibility. One popular item was the vampire alarm, a complex arrangement of bells and string that supposedly rang when the undead approached. In practice, it mostly rang when mice approached or when the wind blew, or when someone looked at it too hard. Another stall offered vampire-repelling bed curtains woven with silver thread, though the silver content was questionable given how quickly they tarnished in the damp night air. As the market's popularity grew, so too did its absurdities. A traveling dentist set up shop offering fang filing for those worried about suspiciously pointy teeth. A baker sold garlic bread so strong it repels from within, though several customers reported digestive consequences more terrifying than any vampire attack. One particularly inventive soul marketed vampire insurance. For a small weekly fee, he would guarantee rescue from any vampire encounter. Though the fine print revealed this rescue consisted primarily of him shouting loudly from a safe distance. Hubert, watching his legitimate business suffer, finally snapped. He purchased 6 bottles of the cheapest holy water he could find, mixed them with actual garlic extract, and began selling his own deluxe protection kits at a loss just to drive the imposters out of business. The resulting price war left the market flooded with increasingly bizarre products, as vendors tried to differentiate themselves. The climax came during the so-called Night of 1,000 Steaks, when 3 separate stalls began selling vampire transformation reversal kits. Each contained wildly different ingredients. One included an egg, a horseshoe, and instructions to stand in a river at midnight, yet all sold out within hours. The fact that no one in living memory had actually recovered from vampirism didn't seem to dampen enthusiasm. As dawn's first light crept over the market stalls, causing several vendors to hastily cover their wares with black cloth, the true genius of the operation became clear. In a town gripped by fear, the market didn't just sell products. It sold a comforting illusion of control. Never mind that the vampire-detecting hounds were clearly just stray dogs with red ribbons tied around their necks. Ignore that the ancient anti-vampire tome was written in what appeared to be someone's shaky handwriting. Overlook the fact that the invincible wooden stakes snapped if you looked at them sideways. What mattered was that when villagers returned home with their purchases clutched tightly, they could tell themselves they'd done something, that they were prepared, that they had, if not an actual solution, at least the satisfying weight of commerce in their hands. And if some of those purchases happened to glow faintly in the dark, or whisper when left alone, or occasionally rearrange themselves on kitchen tables when no one was looking, well, that was just the power of suggestion. Probably. Meanwhile, in the abandoned windmill on Gallows Hill, Count Vladimir sorted through his newest acquisitions, a set of vampire-proof locks purchased from the market. With a smile that showed entirely too many teeth, he carefully picked one open using a spoon. The undead, it seemed, found the whole market situation endlessly entertaining, and business for everyone involved was booming. Chapter 7. The Nobleman who hosted a very suspicious ball. Lord Peregrine's St. Cloud Smiles invitation arrived on parchment so thick it could have stopped a crossbow bolt, edged in black lace that smelled faintly of old roses, and something metallic. The ink swirled in deep crimson, declaring a grand nocturnal revel to be held at Blackthorn Manor, with festivities commencing precisely at moonrise and concluding ye be before the accursed dawn. The townsfolk of Bracken Hollow had never been invited to anything grander than a barn-raising, so naturally they accepted en masse. Hubert the garlic merchant sewed himself a new waistcoat. Barnaby Sneed practiced his courtly bow until he nearly toppled into a water trough. Even the mayor dug out a moth-eaten frock coat that had last seen daylight during the previous century's fashions. The first sign that something was amiss came when the carriages arrived after sunset. Black lacquered things drawn by horses so impeccably groomed they looked like they'd been polished. The second sign was the footmen, who moved with such preternatural grace they seemed to glide rather than walk, their powdered wigs impeccable despite the evening mist. By the time the guests reached the manor's grand entrance, where the doors swung open without visible assistance, most were too awed to question why their host's family crest featured a bat with a goblet. Lord Peregrine greeted them in the grand hall, his smile as sharp as the crystal chandeliers overhead. He was a tall man, pale in a way that suggested he'd never met the sun, and disapproved of the acquaintance. His cravat tied so high it nearly brushed his earlobes. "Welcome, dear Mort Frensing," he corrected smoothly, raising a goblet that upon closer inspection seemed to contain something darker than wine. The ballroom was a masterpiece of Gothic extravagance. Candles burned with flames that didn't flicker in the draught. The musicians played waltzes with an eerie precision, never pausing for breath. And the hors d'oeuvres, well, "Is this steak tartare?" the mayor's wife whispered, poking at a delicately arranged plate of raw meat. "Rota tartare, actually," murmured a passing server without breaking stride. Conversation faltered. Then Barnaby Sneed, ever the social climber, loudly declared it exquisitely continental and helped himself to 3 servings. The dancing commenced with alarming vigor. Lord Peregrine's guests moved with uncanny grace, their steps synchronized like a flock of birds changing direction mid-flight. The local villagers did their best to keep up, though their attempts at the danse macabre mostly involved stumbling and apologizing. Hubert, who had never danced a day in his life, found himself swept into a whirlwind by a woman in a gown the color of dried violets, who he realized too late seemed to be leading with strength far beyond her delicate frame. "Lovely weather we're having," Hubert ventured, then immediately regretted it as his partner's smile revealed a hint of pointed canines. Nighttime. "Hale weather is lovely when one never sees daylight," she replied, spinning him so fast his feet briefly left the floor. Meanwhile, Barnaby had cornered a group of aristocrats near the punch bowl, regaling them with his extensive knowledge of vampiric customs, all invented that morning. The nobles listened with polite, frozen smiles, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested they were either deeply impressed or contemplating how best to drain him without ruining the carpet. The mayor, ever the diplomat, attempted small talk with a countess whose necklace appeared to be made of human teeth. "Charming estate," he offered. "The decor is so Ebon-inspired." "Yes," the countess replied, stroking a candelabra shaped like a skeletal hand. "Refined anatomy, endlessly decorative." As midnight approached, the festivities took a darker turn. A game of blind man's bluff resulted in 3 villagers fainting when the blindfolded It player demonstrated an uncanny ability to track them by heartbeat alone. The portrait gallery turned out to feature paintings that changed when viewed from different angles, the sweet-faced maiden in one frame becoming decidedly more fanged when observed from the left. And the refreshment table now prominently featured a fountain running with what was definitely not wine. Hubert, sensing imminent peril, attempted a discreet exit, only to find every door he tried led back to the ballroom. "Cod architecture," muttered a passing duke, somehow already holding Hubert's abandoned garlic pouch. "A labyrinthiner, really." The climax came when Lord Peregrine ascended the grand staircase and proposed a toast. "To new acquaintances," he purred, raising his goblet as the chandeliers dimmed. Around the room, his guests' eyes began to glow. Just slightly. Just enough. In the panicked silence that followed, the mayor cleared his throat. "Wonderfuling party," he squeaked. "But we really must be going." "Nonsense," cried Barnaby, now swaying alarmingly from what he thought was punch. "The night is young. Or at least one deaden." What happened next depended greatly on who was telling the story. The villagers would later insist they made a dignified retreat. The servants would recount hysterical screaming, and at least 2 people climbing out through windows. Hubert had maintained he strategically withdrawn while reciting garlic recipes. But as the last carriage fled down the manor's drive, one thing became abundantly clear. Lord Peregrine's ball had been the social event of the season, and everyone was still invited. Indefinitely. I'm Back in Bracken Hollow, the next week saw a sudden surge in church attendance, garlic sales, and people very carefully checking their reflections in mirrors. Barnaby, nosing what he claimed was ballroom fatigue, but looked suspiciously like 2 puncture wounds on his neck, began writing a memoir titled G.A. Night to Remember, My Time Among the Quality Undead. And Hubert, he started stalking Yaholic garlic, just in case. Chapter 8. The Peasant's Guide to Improvised Weaponry. The problem with vampires, as the villagers of Bracken Hollow were rapidly discovering, was that they didn't play fair. They didn't line up for proper duels at dawn. They didn't respect the rules of engagement. And most frustrating of all, they seemed entirely unimpressed by the town's limited supply of actual weapons. This realization came to a head when old Tom the farmer attempted to stake a vampire with a butter knife. The creature had politely waited for him to finish whittling the utensil into a vaguely pointish shape before plucking it from his hands and using it to clean its fingernails. The message was clear. If Bracken Hollow wanted to survive, they'd need to get creative. The first edition of OOC, Peasant's Guide to Improvised Weaponry, scrawled on the back of a stolen tavern menu by 3 drunk farmers and a very nervous blacksmith, contained such gems as pitchforks, nature's triple steak, cross, 3 chances to hit something vital. Heavy, also useful for farming, so try not to lose them down a vampire's ribcage. And turbo. Kitchen mallets, for when you need to tenderize more than meat. Pros, already in your house. Good for crushing garlic too. Cons, requires close proximity. Hope you like eye contact with the undead. This is soon to be distaffs, not just for spinning wool anymore. Waistros, pointy, usually nearby. Your grandmother won't miss it. Elis. Cons, your grandmother will absolutely miss it and blame you when the vampires come for her next. Young Jimmy Tallow became something of a local celebrity when he successfully fended off a vampire attack using nothing but a sausage link and quick thinking. The creature had been mid-sneer about pathetic mortal weapons when Jimmy tossed the garlic-stuffed meat like a rope over a rafter, swinging directly into the vampire's knees. It wasn't lethal, but the indignity of being knocked over by a swinging 12-year-old in a cured meat product apparently violated some ancient vampire code of honor, because the creature left in a huff and hadn't been seen since. The blacksmith's apprentice, inspired by Jimmy's success, developed what he called the flail cuisine, a frying pan tied to a length of chain, with garlic cloves welded to the cooking surface. While theoretically devastating, the first test swing took out 2 shelves of pottery and the blacksmith's favorite tankard. The device was quietly retired after its creator knocked himself unconscious during a demonstration. More practical innovations emerged from necessity. The miller's wife discovered her bread paddle made an excellent blunt instrument when applied vigorously enough to a vampire's temple. The cooper started producing barrels with detachable staves that doubled as clubs. Even the town's notoriously frail librarian weaponized her most precious resource by developing a throwing technique for heavy books, though her aim was so poor she mostly just annoyed the vampires with repeated blows to the knees. Barnaby Sneed, never one to be outdone, published his own definitive treatise on household vampire defense, which included such questionable advice as a sufficiently loud monologue about local taxation laws may bore them into retreat, and if all else fails, pretend to be mad. Vampires are notoriously fussy about their food source. The pamphlet sold terribly until Barnaby started claiming it was written in collaboration with an actual vampire. It wasn't. And blessed by the Pope, it definitely wasn't. Hubert, saying Profit in panic, began offering weaponized garlic bundles, essentially regular garlic braids with the stems left long enough to whip like flails. They were marginally effective at best, but the psychological impact of being smacked in the face with a bundle of produce apparently stung vampire pride enough to make them think twice. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Widow Hargrove's prize-winning roses. After noticing vampires gave her garden a wide berth, she distilled the thorns into a tincture that, when applied to weapons, caused the undead to recoil as if burned. The discovery led to a nighttime raid on every rosebush in town, followed by a very tense standoff when the gardening club realized the blacksmith was stealing cuttings from their award-winning specimens. As the arms race escalated, so too did the vampires' amusement. Count Vladimir was spotted taking notes during one particularly chaotic village defense drill. Lady Carmilla began leaving helpful critiques of people's fighting form pinned to their doors with knife-like precision, and the newly vampiric Dr. Bainsworth took to offering unsolicited medical advice during attacks, shouting things like "That's not proper stake-wielding posture," and "You'll strain your rotator cuff like that," between dodging hurled kitchenware. The most surreal moment came when the mayor, in a desperate bid for normalcy, attempted to host a village defense fair, complete with prize ribbons for best improvised weapon. The event was going surprisingly well until the judging booth collapsed, due to being constructed entirely of sharpened broom handles, at which point the vampires waiting in line for the most creative threat category sighed and helped rebuild it. By month's end, Bracken Hollow had become a strange sort of proving ground. Vampires would appear not to feed, but to test new defenses. Villagers stopped screaming during attacks and started offering running commentary instead. Notice how he dodged left there. The garlic salve must be working. An uneasy détente formed where both sides respected particularly clever improvisations. The vampires would often retreat from well-executed defenses with something almost like admiration, while the villagers begrudgingly stopped trying to stab anything that moved after dark. The only real casualty in all of this was dignity. The vampires had lost some mystique. The villagers had lost their fear of shadows. And somewhere in the middle, a new understanding formed: that survival wasn't about having the right weapons, but about being just clever enough, just stubborn enough, to make the undead reconsider whether you were worth the trouble. That, and keeping a very tight grip on your grandmother's distaff. Chapter 9. The priest who blessed everything, including the chickens. Father Anselm had always been a man of measured faith. His sermons tended toward the practical, his blessings were distributed sparingly, and his holy water was reserved for actual sacraments rather than casual use. This changed abruptly when he witnessed the baker's wife crossing herself with a wooden spoon, and suddenly realized his parish was spiraling into folkloric chaos. The first sign of his newfound zeal came when he blessed the church's doorknobs, then the hinges, then the entire doorway. By week's end, he'd worked his way through every surface in the chapel, leaving the holy water font perpetually empty and the altar boys perpetually damp. When questioned about this escalation, he simply muttered something about preventative divinity and moved on to blessing the cemetery gates. Not just once, but every hour on the hour, like some sort of spiritual timekeeper. The villagers initially found this reassuring. There's comfort in knowing your local priest is taking vampire defense seriously. But when Father Anselm began lurking near the town well with a vial of holy water and an intense expression, ready to bless each bucket as it emerged, even the most pious started giving him wide berth. His habit of suddenly splashing passers-by while shouting Latin declensions didn't help matters. The real trouble began when his blessing spree expanded beyond architecture and into the animal kingdom. It started innocently enough with the church mouser, who endured a sprinkling with remarkable patience before shaking itself off and stalking away with what could only be described as Protestant indignation. But when Father Anselm cornered Widow Hargrove's prize rooster in the churchyard and attempted to perform what appeared to be a full baptismal rite, the situation escalated. "Father," the widow protested as she pried her squawking bird from his arms. "That's a chicken." "And now it's a blessed chicken," he replied with unsettling serenity, wiping holy water from his brow. "Imagine the vampire that tries to drain this poultry." Against all logic, the concept caught on. Soon farmers were lining up outside the chapel with livestock in tow. The blacksmith brought his forged tools. "If I hammer a blessed anvil, does that make the nails holy?" The baker requested his sourdough starter receive last rites just in case. Even Barnaby Sneed showed up with a suspiciously shaped bundle that might have been a shovel or possibly his laundry. Father Anselm blessed it anyway without looking. The vampires, for their part, found this development alternately amusing and insulting. Count Vladimir took to leaving little notes on the church door like my compliments on the font. The burning sensation was truly exquisite. "And would you consider blessing the tavern's ale? I do enjoy a challenge." Lady Carmilla began appearing just outside the range of Father Anselm's holy water sprinkles to dramatically fan herself and sigh about overzealous clergy. The breaking point came when Hubert arrived with his entire garlic cart, demanding a wholesale blessing for inventory purposes. Father Anselm, now operating on what appeared to be divine autopilot, obliged with such enthusiasm that the ensuing spiritual energy supposedly made 3 nearby candles spontaneously relight. The resulting double-blessed garlic, as Hubert marketed it, sold out immediately, though some customers reported it now made their eyes water at 30 paces. Meanwhile, the town's actual spiritual needs began suffering. A wedding nearly descended into chaos when the groom sneezed during his vows, and Father Anselm reflexively doused him in holy water. A funeral procession had to be halted when the priest became distracted blessing every tree along the roadside, just in case. Confession became impossible because he kept interrupting penitents to anoint the confessional booth's walls. The mayor finally intervened after catching Father Anselm attempting to bless the moon. "It's reflecting sunlight," the priest explained earnestly, as the mayor pried the holy water flask from his fingers. "Think of the multiplicative holy potential." What followed was less an intervention and more a subdued tea party, where concerned villagers took turns reminding their clergymen that while faith was important, so was sleeping occasionally. The church mice, now so thoroughly blessed they practically glowed, served as silent witnesses to this negotiation. In the end, a compromise was reached. Father Anselm would limit his blessings to scheduled hours except in cases of immediate undead provocation. Town would provide him with additional holy water stores, and possibly a minder. And the chickens, well, the chickens remained blessedly ambiguous on the matter. As for the vampires, they adjusted their habits accordingly. Attacks became slightly less frequent but more theatrical, as if compensating for the increased spiritual defenses. And one particularly wet night, the villagers awoke to find every door in town marked with a single, perfectly placed drop of holy water, applied from the inside. Father Anselm took this as a sign of divine approval. The rest of Bracken Hollow took it as a sign to check their locks twice. And the chickens? They stopped laying for a week, as if offended by the entire affair. Chapter 10. The Vampire Who Just Wanted to Be a Baker. Mortimer Fondot had never asked to be undead. He hadn't been some brooding aristocrat yearning for eternal darkness, nor a reckless occultist dabbling in forces beyond mortal ken. He'd been a simple baker's apprentice in the wrong place at the wrong time, specifically a moonlit alley behind Count Vladimir's favorite tavern, at precisely the wrong moment when the Count had been feeling peckish but sentimental. "Look at those kneading motions," Vladimir had apparently exclaimed to Lady Carmilla as they watched Mortimer through the bakery window the night before his turning. "Such perfect gluten development. We haven't had a decent pastry maker in the brood since 1742. And so Mortimer had awoken in a velvet-lined coffin, with an insatiable thirst for blood and an equally insatiable urge to proof dough. It was, as existential crises went, unusually specific. His first attempt to return to his old life had been doomed from the start. The sunlight issue was problematic enough for a profession that required pre-dawn starts, But the real trouble came when he caught himself absent-mindedly fanging a baguette during the final bake. The resulting puncture caused the loaf to deflate with a disappointed wheeze that still haunted his nightmares. Unterterrit, Mortimer adapted. He took to night baking, experimenting with recipes that didn't require daylight. His midnight rye became something of a hit among nocturnal customers, though the vampire sourdough, made with a starter he'd accidentally gotten some of his own blood into, was politely declined after the first batch made a tavern patron's hair grow 3 inches overnight. The villagers, for their part, weren't sure what to make of the polite young vampire who kept apologizing while taking their blood. "Sorry about this," he'd murmur as he carefully punctured a vein. "Would you like a complimentary muffin with that?" His victims often awoke on his bakery's back bench wrapped in a quilt, a fresh pastry in hand and considerably less blood in their veins than they'd prefer, but with surprisingly neat puncture marks. His real nemesis proved to be the baker he'd once apprenticed under. Old man Hovis had not taken kindly to undead competition, especially not from his former student. He took to hanging garlic braids with the same enthusiasm others displayed holiday decorations, and once attempted to stake Mortimer with a rolling pin during a particularly tense croissant demonstration. "You're unnatural," Hovis had shrieked as Mortimer ducked behind a stack of flour sacks. "So he's using baking powder instead of proper fermentation. But you don't see me judging." Mortimer shot back, a low blow that started a flour bomb fight lasting until dawn sent him scrambling for his coffin. Hubert, the garlic merchant, saw opportunity in this rivalry. He began selling Baker's special garlic braids, extra pungent, with optional cinnamon scent to confuse vampire senses. Hovis bought them in bulk, leaving Mortimer to take increasingly elaborate detours around the bakery that now smelled like an Italian restaurant's idea of Christmas. The breaking point came during the annual Bracken Hollow Bread Festival. Mortimer had painstakingly prepared his entry, a dark rye resurrection loaf shaped like a coffin that would split open to reveal garlic-infused buns inside. But between Hovis sabotaging his oven temperature and Count Vladimir's ill-timed visit to offer moral support, which mostly involved lounging dramatically across the judging table complaining about the lack of hemoglobin in the refreshments, disaster struck. Mortimer's display bread actually resurrected, not fully and not intelligently, but the doughy limbs that peeled themselves from the baking tray and began flopping toward the judge's stand marked the first time in festival history that a bread entry caused screaming. Hovis, ever the traditionalist, immediately declared this cheating. The mayor fainted. Count Vladimir applauded. In the chaos that followed, which included at least 3 failed exorcism attempts and the local priest blessing a breadbasket with concerning enthusiasm, Mortimer had an epiphany. He wasn't a baker who happened to be a vampire. He was a vampire who happened to bake. The distinction was subtle but important. His new night rise bakery and light bloodletting opened the following week. The sign featured a cartoon bat holding a rolling pin, which Mortimer found embarrassing but Count Vladimir insisted was branding. The menu offered artisanal breads alongside lightly sourced plasma, all ethically obtained via voluntary donors who received loyalty punch cards, 10 pints, e.g., free month of pastries. Hovis took to standing outside making loud comments about proper bakeries and natural fermentation, but even he had to admit the undead made excellent sourdough. The constant temperature of a coffin proved ideal for starter maintenance. As for Mortimer, he found an odd contentment in his undead existence. His customers no longer screamed when he emerged from the flour cellar. The village children adored his fang cookies, painted red with food coloring, much to Father Anselm's dismay. And if sometimes at dawn, as he wiped flour from his hands and retreated to his coffin, he caught himself wistfully watching the human bakers begin their day, well, at least he never had to wake up early for morning shifts. Somewhere in the manor on the hill, Count Vladimir smiled to himself as he nibbled a perfectly flaky pane au plasma. Turning a baker, he reflected, might have been his best idea since that time he'd turned a tax collector just to watch the chaos. The brood needed more artisans. Perhaps a cheesemaker next. Chapter 11. The Great Garlic Heist of 1347. The plan had seemed foolproof in the dim light of the drunken hound's back room. 5 men, a moonless night, and one heavily guarded garlic cellar. What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, the answer was everything, starting with the fact that no one had properly considered the olfactory ramifications of stealing several hundred pounds of allium sativum. "We should have brought nose plugs," groaned Big Tom, the erstwhile leader of this ill-conceived venture, as they crouched behind Hubert's storage shed. The air hung thick with the pungent aroma of garlic, a smell so potent it made their eyes water. Little Jim, the gang's lockpick, had already abandoned his post twice to vomit in the bushes. The scheme had been born of desperation and greed in equal measure. With the vampire scare driving garlic prices to ludicrous heights, Hubert's warehouse had become the equivalent of a royal treasury, if said treasury could be smelled from 3 streets away. The thieves, none of whom had any prior experience with grand larceny, unless one counted Big Tom's legendary pie theft at the 1346 Harvest Festival, had imagined themselves becoming overnight kings of the black market. They hadn't imagined the smell. Breaking in proved easier than anticipated. The padlock surrendered to Little Jim's shaking hands after only 15 minutes, during which time the would-be thieves learned 2 important facts. First, that concentrated garlic vapor could indeed penetrate leather gloves, and second, that prolonged exposure made one's fingertips tingle in a deeply concerning way. The door swung open to reveal stacks upon stacks of garlic braids, their pale bulbs gleaming like malignant pearls in the dim lantern light. It was at this point that the first complication arose. "Which ones do we take?" whispered nervous Ned, the gang's lookout, whose face had taken on a greenish hue. "All of them." Big Tom had intended this to sound commanding, but the coughing fit that followed somewhat undercut his authority. The second complication arrived in the form of Hubert's guard system, not the sleeping watchman they'd easily circumvented, but his far more alert canine companion. Brutus was a monstrous beast with breath that could wilt flowers at 30 paces, a side effect of his diet consisting largely of garlic-stuffed scraps from Hubert's table. The dog regarded the intruders with the calm demeanor of an animal that knew its mere presence constituted biological warfare. "Nice doggy," cooed Little Jim, extending a trembling hand. Brutus yawned. The resulting gust of garlic-laden air knocked the thieves back a step. Somewhere in the distance, a vampire who'd been considering an approach to the village abruptly turned and walked the other way. The third complication, the one that truly doomed the enterprise, was the sheer physicality of garlic theft. The braids were heavier than they looked, the stems slippery, the bulbs prone to breaking loose and rolling into dark corners, where they would inevitably be discovered later. Half an hour into their heist, the thieves were sweating profusely, their eyes streaming tears of either emotion or chemical irritation, their pockets bulging with stolen clothes that burned through the fabric like tiny acidic grenades. It was Big Tom who first noticed the change in Brutus's demeanor. The dog had stopped panting and was now staring intently at the door. A moment later, the thieves heard it too, the distinctive sound of Hubert's footsteps approaching, accompanied by his habitual off-key humming. Panic ensued. Little Jim attempted to hide in a barrel of peeled cloves and emerged seconds later, looking like he'd been chemically exfoliated. Nervous Ned became entangled in a garlic braid and began spinning like a top as he tried to free himself. Big Tom made a valiant effort to carry an entire rack of garlic out the back window, only to discover that garlic racks don't fit through windows, especially when one is simultaneously gagging and blind from sweat. Hubert found them like that. A pile of groaning, reeking humanity in the middle of his storeroom, Brutus sitting atop the heap like a conquering hero. To his credit, the garlic merchant didn't call the guards immediately. First he made them restring every broken braid, then inventory the entire stock, then peel 3 bushels for his morning orders. By dawn the would-be thieves stumbled out of the shop, their clothes permanently fragrant, their eyes bloodshot, their dreams of criminal enterprise thoroughly crushed. The village awoke to find the thieves curled up in the town square, moaning softly and occasionally dry-heaving. A crowd gathered, including Barnaby Sneed, who immediately began narrating the scene as if it were a sporting event, and Father Anselm, who blessed the thieves reflexively before realizing they weren't actually vampire victims. Hubert emerged from his shop holding a freshly peeled clove, which he casually tossed between his hands as he addressed the crowd. "Anyone else want to try stealing from me?" he asked pleasantly. The silence was broken only by the sound of Brutus licking his chops. Somewhere in the distance, Count Vladimir sneezed. The great garlic heist entered local legend, not as a cautionary tale about crime, but as a brutal lesson in chemistry. The thieves eventually recovered, though little Jim would start sweating at the sight of Italian food, and nervous Ned developed a nervous tic every time someone said seasoning. Big Tom took up beekeeping, the only profession he could find where strong odors were an asset rather than a liability. As for Hubert, business boomed. His new line of thieves' deterrent garlic necklaces sold out within hours, despite being identical to his regular stock, but with a 20% markup. The vampires gave his shop an even wider berth, repelled not by any spiritual power, but by simple self-preservation. And in the dead of night, when the village slept and only Brutus stood guard over the garlic stores, one could sometimes hear a faint, reeking breeze rustle through the braids, nature's perfect security system, ensuring that while vampires might stalk the night, no one in their right mind would ever steal from Hubert again. Chapter 12. The town that invented the 24-hour diner. The idea had come to the mayor in a sleep-deprived epiphany at 3 in the morning, which perhaps explained why it made perfect sense at the time, but seemed increasingly deranged in the light of day. If we're all awake anyway, he proclaimed to the bleary-eyed town council, why not make money from it? Thus began Bracken Hollow's great nighttime economy experiment, a desperate attempt to out-commercialize the undead. The Drunken Hound Tavern became the first establishment to test this theory by rebranding itself as the Tipsy Owl, now with 100% fewer vampires in your ale. Owner Gerald Figwort installed extra lanterns, hired a night barmaid whose glare could sterilize water, and introduced a midnight mug special that was really just daytime ale, but cost twice as much. To everyone's surprise, business boomed. There's nothing like existential dread to make a population thirsty, and the tavern's new slogan, "You can't be drained if you're already pickled," proved disturbingly effective. Other businesses followed suit with varying degrees of success. The blacksmith started offering moonlight sharpening, though the quality suffered considerably when performed by a man operating on 3 days without sleep. The baker produced vampire vigil loaves, dense bricks of dough fortified with enough caffeine-rich herbs to make a man see through time. Even Father Anselm got in on the act with after-dark absolutions, though these often devolved into him, falling asleep mid-Hail Mary while penitents awkwardly patted his shoulder. Hubert, ever the opportunist, erected a nighttime garlic stand right outside the tavern, capitalizing on Drunkard's sudden bouts of piety. His last call cloves sold for premium prices to patrons who'd suddenly remember they'd promised their mothers they'd carry protection. The stand's sign, "Drink responsibly, stake irresponsibly," became something of a local catchphrase. Not all ventures fared so well. The cobbler's attempt at overnight repairs resulted in several shoes being fitted to the wrong feet, and one unfortunate incident involving a boot nailed to a stool. The miller's all-night grinding led to a peculiar batch of flour that seemed to move when left unattended. And Barnaby Sneed's vampire tours by candlelight ended abruptly when he mistook a stack of barrels for Count Vladimir and stabbed it repeatedly with a butter knife. The real innovation came from Widow Hargrove, who converted her chicken coop into the town's first 24-hour diner. The early rooster served eggs at all hours, along with suspiciously flexible pancakes and a house special called the Sunrise, which contained no actual sunlight but did feature alarming amounts of turmeric. The establishment became a haven for night workers, insomniacs, and vampires who just wanted to brood over coffee without being judged. Lady Carmilla became an unexpected regular, though she insisted on bringing her own chalice and complained endlessly about the lack of type O negative in the syrup selection. "You mortals, and your maple flavoring," she'd sneer while stirring her tea with a finger that definitely hadn't been in the cup a moment before. The widow, to her credit, charged her extra for the trouble and used the profits to install garlic-infused wallpaper. The experiment reached its zenith, or nadir, depending on whom you asked, during the summer solstice midnight mock. Every business in town stayed open continuously for 24 hours, creating a surreal carnival of commerce and exhaustion. The blacksmith demonstrated sword techniques while sleepwalking. The baker produced a loaf shaped like a coffin that someone accidentally blessed, leading to a brief but concerning period of movement in the breadbasket. Hubert sold solstice survival kits containing garlic, holy water, and a tiny hammer that served no discernible purpose. By dawn, the town resembled the aftermath of a particularly festive plague. Half the population had fallen asleep where they stood. The other half had entered a strange, wakeful delirium where they argued with street signs and confessed sins to stray cats. The mayor was found attempting to purchase a chicken from the butcher using acorns as currency, while Barnaby Sneed had wrapped himself in a tapestry and was declaring himself king of the night shift. Only the vampires seemed refreshed, moving through the wreckage with amused precision. Count Vladimir left generous tips at every establishment. Dr. Bainsworth distributed tonics for nocturnal fatigue that mostly just made people hallucinate pleasantly. Even Alistair, the furniture rearranger, helped by turning all the tavern stools to face west, which no one noticed until the next evening. In the end, Bracken Hollow found its equilibrium. Some businesses returned to daylight hours. Others discovered their true calling as night purveyors. The diner flourished, the tavern's late shift became legendary, and Hubert developed a profitable side gig selling warding nightcaps stuffed with garlic. The vampires adjusted their habits accordingly, developing a taste for pre-dawn croissants and learning to ignore the inherent comedy of watching humans try to function without sleep. An uneasy harmony settled over the town, one where undead and living alike could agree on one fundamental truth. Nothing good happens after 2 a.m. Not for mortals, not for vampires, and certainly not for the baker's apprentice who tried to invent espresso 200 years early. Chapter 13. The Awkward Family Reunion with Fangs. The letter arrived on parchment so old it crackled when unfolded, the ink faded to rust brown, and the seal bearing a crest Gregor Shingleback hadn't seen since childhood. It was from his cousin Aldous, or rather, from someone who had once been his cousin, Aldous, before disappearing into the night 20 years prior under mysterious circumstances that the family still only discussed in hushed tones after several pints. Dearest cousin, the letter began in elegant script that somehow managed to look smug. Find myself returned to our fair region, and would be simply delighted to reacquaint myself with my favorite blood relation. Do come for dinner. I've taken up residence in the old Windermere crypt. Black hair, optional, appetite mandatory, appetite mandatory. Gregor stared at the missive for a full minute before muttering, "Oh, hell's teeth." The first reunion dinner was, by any measure, a disaster. Gregor arrived bearing gifts, a nice bottle of wine, and a string of garlic he intended to claim was decorative, only to find Aldous dramatically posed atop a sarcophagus like a man who'd been practicing the maneuver in front of a mirror. Their initial embrace was cut short when Aldous' fangs snagged Gregor's best cravat. "You've changed?" Gregor managed as his cousin licked spilled wine from his wrist with alarming precision. "Undying existence suits me, don't you think?" Aldous twirled his cape, because of course he wore a cape now, billowing with theatrical flair. No more gout, no more taxes, and the ladies find eternal pallor quite striking these days. The meal itself proved awkward. Gregor pushed roasted beets around his plate while Aldous made pointed comments about the lack of proper beverages and kept glancing meaningfully at Gregor's neck. Conversation stuttered through family updates: Aunt Mildred dead, Uncle Theodore undead, little Penelope married to a nice butcher who apparently tasted divine, culminating Aldous presenting Gregor with an heirloom pocket watch that had been missing since his disappearance. "I believe this is yours," Aldous purred, producing it from his waistcoat with a flourish. Gregor accepted it warily. "You stole this the night you left, didn't you?" "Borrowed? For sentimental value." Aldous' smile revealed entirely too many teeth. "Speaking of which, how's your cholesterol these days?" The subsequent family gatherings followed a similarly uncomfortable pattern. Aldous would host increasingly elaborate dinners. Black candles, liver served suspiciously rare, servants who never blinked. While Gregor would arrive bearing increasingly obvious protective charms, blessed silverware, garlic-stuffed handkerchiefs, one memorable occasion where he wore an entire wreath of onions around his neck like a floral collar. Their exchanges became a delicate dance of familial obligation and barely veiled threats. "You really should try the pâté," Aldous would insist, sliding a dish toward Gregor that pulsed faintly. "I'm watching my figure," Gregor would demur, edging his chair closer to the candelabra. The rest of Bracken Hollow found the situation endlessly entertaining. Barnaby Sneed started taking bets on when Gregor would finally get bitten. Hubert developed a line of family reunion kits containing garlic, holy water, and a pamphlet on saying no to peer pressure. Even the vampires got in on the act. Lady Carmilla took to leaving dinner party tips in Gregor's mailbox. "A proper bloodletting requires linen napkins, darling," while Count Vladimir kept accidentally bumping into him at the butcher shop and making pointed comments about his jugular. Matters came to a head during the annual Shingleback family picnic, an event now complicated by Aldous' inability to attend daytime gatherings and Gregor's refusal to host after dark. They compromised by meeting at twilight in the churchyard, where Aldous lounged dramatically across a tombstone, while Gregor nervously doled out potato salad from a dish that also contained several hidden cloves of garlic. "This is ridiculous," Aldous snapped when his third attempt to steer conversation toward Gregor's blood type was thwarted by an aunt loudly discussing her varicose veins. "I'm trying to have a proper familial bonding experience here." "You tried to exsanguinate the vicar during carrés." Aldous waved a dismissive hand. He was being dramatic about the resurrection clues. "Besides, I only took a pint." The argument might have escalated further if not for the sudden arrival of little Tommy Shingleback, who took one look at his undead uncle and burst into tears. Something about the child's wailing, so raw, so utterly human, seemed to pierce through Aldous' carefully cultivated ennui. With a sigh more dramatic than strictly necessary, he sank onto a bench and allowed Tommy to examine his fangs with grubby, curious fingers. "Fine," Aldous muttered as Tommy experimentally poked a canine. "No biting relatives, but I'm still getting you all coffin-shaped fruitcakes for Winterfest." It wasn't perfect. There were still too many crypt invitations and not enough explanations for why Gregor kept showing up to gatherings with a tanning oil that smelled suspiciously like marinara. But an understanding had been reached, one that allowed for family loyalty and self-preservation to coexist, however uneasily. Back in town, Hubert adjusted his marketing yet again. The new awkward family gathering survival pack sold briskly, especially in the weeks leading up to holidays. Barnaby Sneed published a sensationalized account of the reunion entitled G.J. Cousins Under the Skin, a tale of blood and bloodier relations, which Aldous bought 6 copies of just to burn them dramatically in his fireplace. And as for Gregor, he took to carrying 2 handkerchiefs, one for show and one stuffed with garlic just in case. Some family traditions, after all, were worth preserving, even if others were better left buried. Chapter 14. The drunkard who mistook a vampire for his ex-wife. The night was deep, the ale was cheap, and Old Man Hobbs' vision was blurrier than the fish's understanding of astronomy. He swayed on his stool at the tipsy owl, squinting through the smoky haze at the elegant figure in black who'd just glided through the door. "Marjorie?" Hob slurred, his voice carrying the particular confidence only achievable through heroic quantities of alcohol. "That you old bloodsucker?" The tavern fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of men lost in their cups, but the razor-edged quiet of a dozen people suddenly very invested in the structural integrity of their tankards. The elegant figure, who was very clearly Count Vladimir Forfolomev, and not anyone's ex-wife, paused mid-stride, one pale eyebrow arching toward his hairline. Hob took this as encouragement. "Thought you could just waltz back in here after all them years, eh?" He staggered upright, brandishing his bottle like a scepter. "I remember what you did with the butcher, and the baker, and that other bloke whose name I forget." Count Vladimir's lips twitched. "I assure you, good sir, I have never—" "Save it for the magistrate, Marjorie." Hob lurched forward, jabbing a finger at the vampire's chest. "You always was a sneaky one, staying out all hours, coming home with suspicious stains on your—" The rest of this accusation was lost to history, as at that moment Hob tripped over his own feet and face-planted directly into the Count's impeccably tailored waistcoat. For a heartbeat, the entire tavern held its breath. Then Vladimir did something entirely unexpected. He laughed. Not the sinister chuckle of a predator toying with its food, but a genuine shoulder-shaking guffaw that made the candle flames dance. "Oh, this is precious," he managed between breaths, steadying Hob with one hand while wiping mirthful tears with the other. "Do go on, my inebriated friend. Tell me more about my alleged affair with the candlestick maker." What followed was perhaps the most surreal tavern brawl in Bracken Hollow's history. Hob, emboldened by liquid courage and lingering marital resentment, alternated between slurred accusations, "You drank all the wine and the maid," and clumsy attempts at fisticuffs. Vladimir, for his part, seemed to be treating the whole affair as participatory theater, dramatically clutching his heart when insulted and occasionally floating just out of reach to sip his wine. "Stand still, woman." Hob bellowed after his fifth wild swing connected only with air. "But darling," Vladimir purred, now perched upside down from a ceiling beam, "you always said I was impossible to pin down." The other patrons, sensing they were witnessing either a historic moment or the world's strangest mating ritual, began placing bets. Huber made a killing selling divorcee special garlic bundles to spectators. Barnaby Sneed took frantic notes for what would later become his best-selling chapbook 8 till Undeath Duous Part. A Drunkard's Guide to Vampiric Annulment. Matters escalated when Hob produced a wooden spoon from somewhere about his person and declared his intention to settle this like in the old days. Vladimir, now thoroughly invested in the bit, responded by summoning a dramatic gust of wind that blew out all the candles and made several petticoats fly over their owners' heads. In the ensuing chaos, which included a startled piglet somehow getting loose from the kitchen, Hob managed to pin the Count against the bar, spoon raised triumphantly. "Gotcha now, you cold-hearted." The spoon snapped against Vladimir's chest with all the force a 70-year-old drunk could muster, which is to say, not much. A beat passed. Hob blinked. "Marjorie, you feel different." Vladimir sighed. "Darling, we need to talk about your eyesight." The revelation that he'd been assaulting an aristocratic vampire rather than his long-absent wife sobered Hob up remarkably fast. So fast, in fact, that his knees gave out entirely, leaving him slumped against the bar like a sack of particularly remorseful potatoes. To everyone's surprise, Vladimir took this in stride. He ordered a round for the house, to celebrate not being exsanguinated, helped Hob into a chair, and even listened politely as the old man tearfully explained about the real Marjorie, who'd run off with a traveling minstrel 20 years prior. By last call, they'd reached an understanding. Hob would stop assaulting strangers, and Vladimir would stop encouraging him for amusement value. The aftermath became local legend. Hubert sold Marjorie's revenge garlic braids with little wooden spoon charms. Barnaby's chapbook went through 3 printings, though the scene where Vladimir pretended to be Marjorie's ghost To frighten Hob into attending temperance meetings might have been exaggerated. Even Lady Carmilla got in on the act, leaving dramatic notes around town signed "Yours eternally, Marjorie," just to watch the old man turn interesting colors. As for Hob, he took to carrying 2 spoons, one for eating and one just in case he needed to relive his glory days. And on particularly foggy nights, when his vision blurred just so, he'd raise a toast to the corner where Count Vladimir sometimes sat, smirking into his wine. To Marjorie, Hob would slur. To Marjorie, the Count would agree solemnly. And somewhere out there, the real Marjorie, now a spry 72-year-old running a vineyard with her minstrel husband, would inexplicably sneeze. Chapter 15. The Overzealous Mob That Staked a Mannequin. It began, as most disasters do, with Barnaby Sneed shouting in the town square. "Vampire!" he bellowed, pointing dramatically toward the dressmaker's window. "Look at how it stands there, unmoving, watching us, practically lurking." The crowd that gathered was already on edge from weeks of sleepless nights and garlic-heavy diets. They peered through the gloom at the figure in the shop window. Tall, pale, draped in fine fabrics, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead with unsettling intensity. "Never blinks," muttered the blacksmith. "Never breathes," added the cooper's wife. "And look at those teeth," cried the miller's daughter, though in fairness the mannequin's teeth were just carved wood slightly warped by humidity. The mob assembled with startling efficiency. Pitchforks were grabbed. Torches were lit. Hubert handed out mob special garlic bundles at a discount. Even Father Anselm arrived in a flurry of holy water and Latin declensions, though he'd misheard the commotion and spent several minutes attempting to exercise a fruit stand before being corrected. The first stake struck home with a satisfying thunking that turned to a concerning clunking as it encountered nothing resembling flesh or bone. The second stake shattered the mannequin's arm, sending a delicately gloved hand spinning into the gutter. It was around the third stake, which went straight through the torso and pinned the figure to the wall, that the crowd began to suspect something was amiss. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Madame Defarge, the dressmaker, screaming in French from her upstairs window. When she finally descended to street level, still clutching her sewing shears like a vengeful deity, the mob had the decency to look abashed. Mostly. "Do you mind?" she snapped, surveying the wreckage of her best display. "That was imported Italian couture. The head alone cost more than your houses." Barnaby, ever the opportunist, attempted to salvage the situation. "In our defense, it was standing very still in a sinister fashion. It's a ye dummy, you absolute turnip." The walk of shame that followed would become legend. The blacksmith had to return the mannequin's wig, which he'd somehow managed to impale on his pitchfork. The cooper's wife sheepishly handed back a silk cravat, now stained with holy water. Hubert quietly offered Madame Defarge a lifetime garlic discount, though this seemed to upset her further. Worse still was the laughter. Not from the villagers. They were too busy contemplating how quickly mass hysteria could turn reasonable people into mannequin murderers, but from the rooftops. Several witnesses swore they saw Count Vladimir and Lady Carmilla observing the whole debacle, the former dabbing at his eyes with a lace handkerchief as he struggled to contain his mirth. The aftermath was particularly brutal for Barnaby Sneed, who found himself briefly exiled from the tavern and forced to endure a week of townsfolk accidentally leaving wooden stakes on his doorstep. Hubert capitalized on the incident with a new line of identification kits containing garlic, a small mirror, and instructions on how to tell living beings from inanimate objects. Father Anselm began offering classes on proper exorcism targets, which mostly consisted of reminding people that furniture didn't usually need spiritual cleansing. As for the mannequin, Madame Defarge gave it pride of place in her shop window with a new sign: "Survivor of the Great Staking. Ask me about my discounts for angry mobs." The joke proved so popular that she eventually commissioned an entire series of vampire outfits for the display, complete with a tiny cape and detachable fangs. The vampires, for their part, found the whole affair endlessly entertaining. A new tradition emerged where they would occasionally pose dramatically in shop windows just to watch villagers do double takes. Young Jimmy Tallow made good money running through the streets shouting false alarm whenever someone inevitably took the bait. And on foggy evenings, when the shadows grew long and the mannequin's glass eyes seemed to follow passers-by a bit too intently, even the most skeptical villagers would cross to the other side of the street, just in case. After all, as Hubert's new signage so wisely noted, better a staked dummy than a dummy with stakes. Chapter 16. The Secret Diary of a Very Bad Vampire Hunter. The leather-bound journal began with admirable intentions, its first page bearing a carefully inked title. Why Noble Pursuit of One Ignatius P. Whitlock, Vampire Hunter Extraordinaire. Ink was still gleaming when Ignatius made his first entry, full of the bold proclamations of a man who had read just enough penny dreadfuls to be dangerous. March 3rd. Today marks the beginning of my glorious crusade against the undead scourge plaguing our fair town. Armed with knowledge, Barnaby Sneed's pamphlet Vampires and You, a beginner's guide to staking, courage questionable, and a blessed stake whittled from my grandmother's old chair leg, she will notice. I shall rid Bracken Hollow of its nocturnal menace or perish in the attempt. Pizza Vandersea. Ignatius did not perish, but he did not rid the town of anything except perhaps its stock of bandages. His first foray into vampire hunting occurred outside the Tipsy Owl, where he lay in wait behind a rain barrel, clutching his stake like a man who had only the vaguest idea which end was pointy. His target, none other than Count Vladimir Varfolomeev himself, who had chosen that particular evening to enjoy a leisurely moonlit stroll while humming a jaunty tune. March 4th. Ambush tactics require patience. Also, better foot placement. When I leapt from hiding to deliver my righteous blow, I slipped on a patch of mud and struck the Count squarely in the shin with my stake. He looked down at me, sprawled in the filth, and asked if I needed help up. I declined, loudly, then ran. My retreat was strategic, mostly, and then was steady. Undeterred by this humiliation, Ignatius turned to technology. Inspired by rumors of sunlight's lethality to vampires, he spent 3 nights constructing a solar lance, an elaborate contraption involving a lantern, 12 mirrors, and a pulley system that, when triggered, was supposed to concentrate light into a deadly beam. March 8th. The lance is complete. Tonight, I shall test it upon the foul Lady Carmilla as she glides through the churchyard. The mechanism is flawless. The mirrors are aligned. The rest of the entry was smudged, but the aftermath spoke for itself. The lance did, technically, produce light. Unfortunately, the beam was about as threatening as a sleepy firefly, and the pulley system collapsed under its own weight, sending Ignatius tumbling into a freshly dug grave. Lady Camilla's only comment, delivered as she peered down at him from the edge of the pit, was, "Darling, if you wanted me to bury you, you need only ask." By the second week, Ignatius' journal entries grew increasingly desperate. March 12th. Attempted to poison a vampire's wine with garlic extract. Learned 2 things. Vampires have an excellent sense of smell. 2. Dr. Bainsworth's cure for garlic poisoning is worse than the poisoning. Spent the evening vomiting behind the tavern. The Count left a handkerchief on my back steps. It was monogrammed. I hate him. March 15th. Constructed a holy water sprinkler system around my house. Forgot to account for wind direction. My bedding is now blessed. Also damp, nilsabtigen. Also, I think my cat is considering conversion. Beanden, the March 18th. Disguised myself as a coffin salesman to infiltrate their ranks. Realized too late that vampires don't actually buy coffins, they just take them. Now I owe the carpenter 6 gold pieces for unauthorized borrowing. The breaking point came when Ignatius attempted to trap a vampire using himself as bait. He lay in the middle of the road at dusk, arms crossed over his chest like a corpse, a stake hidden in his sleeve. His plan was flawless. When the vampire leaned in for a bite, he would strike. Instead, he fell asleep. He awoke to the sound of someone gently clearing their throat. Above him stood not just Count Vladimir, but Lady Camilla, Alistair, and a handful of other vampires he didn't recognize, all peering down at him with expressions ranging from amusement to outright pity. "You snore," said the Count. "As so you drool," added Lady Camilla. Alistair, ever helpful, poked him with a stick. "On March 20th, I may need to reassess my career choices. Now paying for the Etiquette. The final entry in the journal was shorter than the rest, written in a resigned but oddly contented hand. March 21st. The Count left a note on my doorstep today. It read, "Your persistence is admirable. Your methods are not. If you truly wish to hunt us, at least learn to do it properly." Beneath it was a signed copy of Vi the Noble Art of Vampire Hunting by some Italian monk. I think this might be the closest thing I'll ever get to a peace offering. I've decided to take him up on it. After all, if you can't beat them, toi desil mi al fin. At least learn to fail more elegantly. Esse and damn orselit. The journal's final pages were filled with increasingly competent sketches of vampire anatomy, notes on proper stake angles, and, curiously, a recipe for garlic-infused bread that the Count had apparently included as a friendly suggestion. And so Ignatius P. Whitlock, vampire hunter extraordinaire, retired, became something rarer, a man who accepted his own limitations with grace. He still kept a stake under his bed, of course, and he still occasionally startled at shadows. But he also began exchanging letters with the Count, debating hunting techniques over tea, and once memorably winning a game of chess against Lady Carmilla by exploiting her irrational hatred of bishops. The vampires, for their part, seemed to appreciate the effort. Attacks in Bracken Hollow grew less frequent, though whether this was due to Ignatius' presence or the simple fact that the undead found the town more entertaining intact remained a matter of debate. As for the journal, it found its way into Barnaby Sneed's hands years later, who published it as a Tithe Complete Idiot's Guide to Vampire Hunting with only minimal embellishments. Ignatius bought 6 copies. He used them as kindling. Chapter 17. The Traveling Salesman Who Sold Vampire-Proof Nightcaps. The wagon rolled into Bracken Hollow on a Thursday, its garish red and gold paint job visible from 3 fields away. Its owner, one Erasmus P. Winthrop III, the 3 was painted on the side in looping script that suggested it had been added recently, had the slick smile of a man who could sell a drowning man water and the wardrobe of someone who had won a bet against a peacock. "Gather round, good people of Bracken Hollow," he bellowed, leaping onto a makeshift stage with the energy of a man who had never encountered skepticism. "Do you fear the creatures of the night? Do you toss and turn, wondering if tonight might be your last? Worry no more, for I, Erasmus P. Winthrop III, bring the finest in undead deterrence this side of, well, anywhere." His first product was the Solar Sanctuary Nightcap, a flimsy linen hat supposedly woven with threads infused with the very essence of sunlight. "Guaranteed to repel vampires or your money back," Erasmus declared dramatically, donning one and striking a pose. Hubert, lurking at the edge of the crowd with arms crossed, muttered, "That's just a sack with holes cut in it." The villagers, desperate for any reassurance, bought them in droves. Next came the dawn-weave bed curtains, which Erasmus claimed were steeped for 40 days and 40 nights in concentrated morning light. The curtains were, in reality, cheap muslin dyed a faint yellow, but their edges were embroidered with tiny sun motifs that made them look official. Even Father Anselm purchased a set, though he insisted on blessing them himself twice just to be safe. The pièce de résistance was the nocturnal negation necklace, a pendant containing what Erasmus swore was a scientifically compressed fragment of actual sunrise. The glass orb at its center glowed faintly when shaken, a neat trick involving fireflies and poor ventilation, and sold for enough coin to make Hubert's garlic prices look charitable. The townsfolk wore their purchases with pride. The blacksmith sported his nightcap even during daylight hours. The mayor's wife hosted a tea party specifically to show off her new curtains. Barnaby Sneed, never one to miss a trend, published a pamphlet titled Accessorizing Against the Apocalypse and sold it alongside Erasmus's wares. The vampires, initially annoyed by this new development, quickly realized the products were harmless. Count Vladimir took to appearing at windows just to watch villagers adjust their nightcaps with solemn reverence. Lady Carmilla once floated through the mayor's bedroom to straighten his dawn-weave curtains while he slept, leaving a note that read, "Lovely drapes." Terrible placement. The scam might have continued indefinitely had it not been for two problems. First, Erasmus got greedy, and second, he underestimated Widow Hargrove. The breaking point came when Erasmus unveiled his ultimate vampire shield, a full-body suit of sun-forged chainmail that weighed as much as a small horse and cost as much as a large one. Widow Hargrove, who had been eyeing Erasmus with increasing skepticism since he claimed his nightcaps were bishop-approved, they weren't, demanded a demonstration. "Of course, madam." Erasmus beamed, unaware of his impending doom. "Observe, as I don this impenetrable armor, and—" Widow Hargrove did not let him finish. She produced a garlic clove from her apron and lobbed it at his chest. The chainmail, which was about as sun-forged as a potato, did nothing to stop the vegetable from bouncing off Erasmus's sternum with a thud loud enough to draw applause. A beat of silence. Then chaos. The ensuing mob might have been worse had the vampires not intervened. Count Vladimir, perhaps taking pity on the man, or perhaps just eager to see what other ridiculous products he might invent, materialized beside Erasmus and cleared his throat. "I believe," the Count said mildly, "you owe these good people refunds." Erasmus's face went the color of spoiled milk. The villagers froze, torn between their anger at the fraud and their terror of the actual vampire in their midst. It was Widow Hargrove who broke the stalemate. "Keep the money," she told Erasmus, waving a hand. "But you're taking these ridiculous curtains with you." And so Erasmus P. Winthrop III left Bracken Hollow, much lighter than he arrived. His wagon now piled high with returned merchandise, his pockets considerably emptier, and his pride thoroughly punctured. The vampires, for their part, seemed to find the whole affair hilarious. Lady Carmilla took to wearing a stolen Solar Sanctuary nightcap during her evening flights, and Dr. Bainsworth, now vampiric himself, published a scathing review of the dawn-weave curtains, titled "Grind the Scientific Impossibility of Bottled Sunrise." As for the villagers, they returned to their garlic braids and wooden stakes with a newfound appreciation for Hubert's honest if pungent wares. The blacksmith melted down his chainmail into a nice set of hinges. The mayor's wife repurposed her curtains into summer dresses. And Widow Hargrove, she kept the necklace. Not because it worked, of course, but because the fireflies inside made a nice nightlight. Chapter 18. The romantic ballad that accidentally summoned more vampires. The first mistake young Jasper the minstrel made was falling in love with the miller's daughter. The second was composing a ballad about it. "Oh, Beatrice fair, with eyes like the moon," he warbled from his usual spot outside the Tipsy Owl, lute clutched to his chest like a shield against heartbreak. He smiled, doth outshine the bright stars all too soon. The song was, by any objective measure, terrible. The meter stumbled like a drunkard. The rhymes were forced to the point of violence, and the chorus contained the word "thee" 3 times in a single line, just to make it scan. But it was sincere, achingly so, and this proved to be Jasper's undoing in more ways than one. The first vampire appeared during the 3rd verse. Jasper, eyes screwed shut in artistic fervor, didn't notice the pale noblewoman weeping dramatically into a lace handkerchief, until he hit the particularly maudlin bridge about eternal parting. When he finally opened his eyes, he found not just Lady Carmilla, but an entire growing crowd of undead spectators perched on fences, leaning against tombstones, and in one case, floating upside down from the tavern sign. "Don't stop," whispered a vampire Jasper didn't recognize, his hollow cheeks glistening with what might have been tears, or possibly just condensation. "It's been centuries since I felt anything, and this is delicious." Thus began Jasper's unintentional career as the premier bard of the undead. His nightly performances drew ever larger crowds of vampires, all sighing dramatically at his tales of unrequited love, and occasionally throwing roses, stolen from graves. At his feet. The living villagers, initially terrified, soon realized creatures were too busy swooning to bother with bloodshed. Some even began staying to watch, if only for the novelty of seeing Count Vladimir dab at his eyes with a silk handkerchief. Beatrice, the miller's daughter, was less amused. "You're attracting more of them," she hissed after one particularly crowded performance, where 3 separate vampires had offered to turn Jasper so we can mourn eternity together. "It's not my fault my art speaks to their tortured souls," Jasper protested. "It's the yay key you're singing in," snapped Hubert, who as usual was profiting from the situation by selling romantic vigil survival kits containing garlic and earplugs. "That high F you keep hitting could summon demons, let alone vampires." Matters came to a head when Jasper, emboldened by his undead fan base, attempted a grand romantic gesture. He composed a new ballad, To Beatrice Beneath Thy Window, and announced he would perform it at midnight beneath her family's mill. The resulting scene would be remembered for generations. Jasper, bathed in moonlight, plucking his lute with more passion than skill. Dozens of vampires clinging to the mill's eaves like morbid bats, sighing in unison at every minor chord. Beatrice's father leaning out of an upper window with a bucket of grain chaff, threatening to dump this on the lot of you. And then, disaster. Jasper, reaching the climax of his song, belted out a high note so piercing it shattered one of the mill's windows. The sound reverberated through the night, carrying farther than any human voice should. For a breathless moment, silence hung over the gathered crowd. Then, from the darkness beyond the village came answering voices. Dozens of them, hundreds to it clear, singing the chorus back in perfect, eerie harmony. "Oh, Noy," whispered Barnaby Sneed, who had been taking notes for what he'd planned to call Lovesick Ballads and Bloodsuckers, a musical romancer. The new vampires arrived in waves, pale figures drifting from the forest, floating down from rooftops, emerging from the river like particularly dramatic bath toys. They had heard the call, they explained, the song of eternal longing, the ballad of undying love. They simply yahding to meet the bard who could voice such exquisite torment. Jasper, to his credit, fainted immediately. The aftermath was surprisingly civil. The original vampire contingent, protective of their musical discovery, formed a barricade around Jasper's prone form, while Count Vladimir negotiated terms with the newcomers. There was some polite hissing, a brief scuffle over whether minor or major keys better conveyed eternal despair. Finally, an accord was reached. Jasper would perform weekly concerts at the old amphitheater outside town. The vampires would stop frightening the livestock, and Beatrice would be left entirely out of it, a condition she heartily endorsed. Bracken Hollow adjusted to its new reality with remarkable speed. The amphitheater was repaired, using vampire strength, which made the work go suspiciously fast. Hubert set up a concession stand, selling sanguine snacks, garlic-free for obvious reasons. Even Father Anselm got in on the act, blessing the venue every Tuesday while pointedly ignoring the undead audience members, pretending to sleep through the prayers. As for Jasper, he became something of a celebrity, though not quite the kind he'd envisioned. His ballads grew increasingly dramatic to satisfy his undead patrons. Lengthy compositions about the cold kiss of eternity and tears like rivers of blood that vampires weeping artistically into their capes. The living villagers mostly came for the novelty and the excellent security. Nothing discourages crime like 200 emotional vampires. Beatrice married the blacksmith's apprentice the following spring. Jasper composed a ballad for the occasion, a cheerful tune in a major key that caused half the vampire attendees to walk out in protest. The Count himself stayed, though he spent the entire reception dramatically fanning himself and muttering about the death of true art. And on moonlit nights, if you listen very carefully near the old amphitheater, you can still hear the faint strains of a lute and the sound of undead sobbing. Mostly in tune. Mostly on purpose. Chapter 19. The final showdown, or so they thought. The plan was simple. That should have been their first warning. At midnight, when the vampire population of Bracken Hollow gathered at the old amphitheater for Jasper's weekly performance of the Ballad of Eternal Sorrow, now in its 3-hour extended edition, the villagers would strike. Hubert's entire garlic stockpile, distilled into an unholy paste, would be spread around the town square. Father Anselm had blessed every well, every door frame, and, in a particularly zealous moment, several chickens. The blacksmith had forged 24 stakes that were, for once, actually made of ash wood. Even Barnaby Sneed had contributed, composing a rousing battle speech that mostly consisted of the phrase, "Death to the undead," repeated with increasingly erratic hand gestures. The vampires, for their part, seemed entirely unaware of the coming assault. They drifted toward the amphitheater as usual, sighing dramatically and comparing the draping techniques of their capes. Count Vladimir paused to compliment Widow Hargrove on her new shawl, which she immediately doused in holy water, much to his amusement. "Tonight," the mayor whispered, as the villagers gathered behind the tavern, their faces smeared with garlic paste for extra protection, "we take back our town." The first phase went surprisingly well. The garlic paste created a pungent barrier around the square. The blessed well water was successfully splashed across several key thoroughfares. And when Jasper, who had been convinced to participate with promises of immortal glory and Beatrice's hand in marriage, she was not consulted, hit a particularly high note, the vampire audience was so engrossed that they didn't notice the villagers creeping into position. Then the attack began. Chaos, as it turned out, was inevitable. The first stake thrown went wide, embedding itself in the amphitheater's wooden stage with a kai-funking that made Jasper yelp mid-chorus. The second stake was dropped by its thrower when he tripped over his own garlic necklace. The third might have actually hit its target if Lady Carmilla hadn't elegantly plucked it from the air and used it to stir her wine goblet. Count Vladimir, perched in the center of the amphitheater, surveyed the scene with the weary patience of a man watching children attempt to arm-wrestle a bear. "Really?" he called over the discordant twang of Jasper's snapped lute string. "This again?" Undeterred, the villagers pressed on. The blacksmith charged with his hammer, only to freeze mid-swing when he realized he was facing Dr. Bainsworth, who tutted and checked his posture. "Lifting with your back like that will leave you sore tomorrow," the vampire physician chided. Widow Hargrove had better luck, managing to bonk Alistair on the head with her rolling pin, but since had been attempting to rearrange her kitchen cabinets at the time, it hardly counted as a wartime victory. The climax came when the mayor, brandishing a torch and what he believed was a vial of holy water. It was salad dressing. Attempted to confront Count Vladimir directly. The vampire watched him approach, sighed, and without breaking eye contact, reached over to adjust the mayor's grip on the torch. "You will burn yourself holding it like that," he said kindly. Somewhere in the chaos, Jasper had started singing again, this time an impromptu song titled "Howdy," to Not Dying Horribly Tonight, and to everyone's surprise, several vampires joined in for the harmony. By dawn, the battle had devolved into something resembling a particularly odd village festival. The garlic paste, while ineffective as a weapon, made a surprisingly good bread dip. The steaks were repurposed as roasting sticks for sausages, and Barnaby Sneed, having abandoned his battle cries, was now taking bets on whether Jasper could hit a C-sharp without fainting. As the sun rose, painting the scene in golden light, the vampires retreated with their usual dramatic flair, though not before Count Vladimir left a note pinned to the tavern door. "Gay de Bracken Hollow." It read, "Your bravery is admirable. Your tactics are not. If you must attempt to destroy us, might we suggest Thursdays? We're less busy then." Fondly, the management. "Peasant unfantity, unbase, carao base anglos." The villagers, exhausted, garlic smeared, and in some cases mildly drunk, took stock of their situation. No one had been killed. No one had even been bitten, unless you counted Old Man Hobbs' incident with the sausage. And he insisted that didn't count. And while they hadn't exactly rid the town of vampires, they had, in some strange way, reached an understanding. Hubert, ever the pragmatist, was already setting up a new stall selling reconciliation garlic, slightly milder, for diplomatic gifting. Father Anselm was blessing the sausages. Just in case. And Jasper, still humming, began composing a new ballad about the whole affair. It would, the vampires later agreed, probably need more minor chords. But that was a problem for next week. For now, Bracken Hollow slept, some in their beds, some against fence posts, and one particularly tipsy individual in a wheelbarrow full of garlic. At peace. Mostly. Chapter 20. The Aftermath. Garlic shortages and lingering suspicion. The garlic shortage hit Bracken Hollow like a bad harvest. Fields that had once overflowed with wheat and barley now stood half-planted with pungent bulbs, the soil so saturated with allium that even the earthworms seemed to recoil. Hubert, once the town's most polarizing merchant, now found himself elevated to near-mythic status, the man who had saved them all one clove at a time. His stall, once a humble cart, had expanded into a full shop, its walls lined with braided strands of garlic, like some holy temple to stench. The problem was no one knew when, or if, they could stop. The vampires had not vanished. They had not been defeated. They had simply stopped attacking. The amphitheater still hosted Jasper's mournful ballads every fortnight, with an undead audience that wept dramatically into silk handkerchiefs. Count Vladimir had taken to strolling through the market at dusk, offering surprisingly insightful critiques of the baker's sourdough. Lady Camilla had even, in a move that scandalized the village, paid for a new set of curtains from Madame Defarge, albeit in coin, that bore the faces of long-dead kings. But trust, once frayed, was not so easily mended. Widow Hargrove still slept with a wreath of garlic around her bedpost, just in case. The blacksmith forged his nails with holy water now, a habit the priest had blessed but the carpenter cursed whenever the wood split. And poor old man Hobbs, still haunted by his drunken confrontation with the Count, had taken to addressing every shadow with a hesitant Marjorie. The mayor tried his best to restore order. He declared the vampire plague officially over, a proclamation met with skeptical silence, and at least one uttered, "That's what they wanted us to think." Church attendance remained high, though Father Anselm's sermons had taken a peculiar turn. dwelling less on damnation and more on coexisting with thine immortal neighbors in peace, or at least without excessive stabbing. The children adapted fastest, as children do. They played a new game called Vampires and Villagers, which mostly involved a lot of dramatic swooping and hissing until someone got smacked with a garlic braid and cried. Young Jimmy Tallow, ever the entrepreneur, sold vampire teeth carved from wood to the younger ones, though the fangs had a suspicious tendency to splinter. But the adults watched. They waited. They measured their neighbor's pallor with sidelong glances, noted who avoided the noonday sun, who never seemed to age, who no longer cast shadows in the right light. Hubert, of course, profited from the paranoia. His new line of subtle protection jewelry, garlic-infused pendants hidden in lockets, flew off the shelves, especially after the blacksmith's wife swore hers had stopped Lady Carmilla from eyeing her neck like a fine wine. Barnaby Sneed published a wildly speculative pamphlet titled Walk Among Us, a survivor's guide to post-plague life, which included such helpful tips as count your reflections at parties, and if your neighbor refuses tea, assume vampirism. Then came the incident at the Harvest Festival. It was supposed to be a return to normalcy, a celebration of survival, of the town's resilience. The tables groaned with food, garlic-heavy dishes kept separate, just in case. The ale flowed freely. Jasper performed an upbeat tune for once, though the vampires in attendance complained it lacked emotional depth. And then, as the bonfire roared and the villagers danced, the unthinkable happened. The mayor's daughter, 16, rosy-cheeked and newly betrothed to the miller's son, stepped into the firelight and cast no shadow. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. The musicians faltered. The dancers stilled. Even the fire seemed to hesitate, its flames flickering uncertainly. The mayor, face ashen, took a trembling step forward. Elsie, she blinked at him, then down at her shadowless feet, and burst out laughing. Oh, that's just the new powder Madame Defarge sold me? It's supposed to make my complexion ethereally pale. She rubbed her cheek, and sure enough, a faint smudge of glittering powder came away on her fingers. The collective exhale could have powered a windmill. But the damage was done. The festival ended early. The mayor's daughter washed her face 3 times just to be sure. And the next morning, Madame Defarge's shop was vandalized with hastily painted garlic bulbs, an act she loudly declared an affront to fashion before selling the marked door to an art collector from the next town over. Life, in its stubborn way, went on. The garlic stores dwindled, then slowly replenished as fields were replanted with less pungent crops. The nightly patrols grew shorter, then ceased altogether when it became clear the vampires had moved on to more interesting pursuits. Count Vladimir had taken up gardening, of all things, though his roses bloomed an unsettling shade of crimson. And Bracken Hollow learned to live with the lingering suspicion, the quiet glances, the way every cough in the night sounded just a little too much like a whisper. They rebuilt. They replanted. They told themselves the plague was over. But no one, not even Hubert, ever stopped keeping garlic in the house. Just in case.